Hey guys, I'm the Tech Prepper. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're finally going to jump into the DMR intro series and start from the beginning. I am brand new to DMR, only have about 2 months of experience with it. I don't know everything, but like most things I do, I like to have a plan, and that's what I want to share with you. Not only do I want to share with you my plan for using DMR as a tool for preparedness, but I actually want to show you how I built out a roadmap to learn DMR and approach it from a very different perspective. I'm not going to approach it from the typical ham radio perspective of connecting it to the internet. There will be no internet involved. So if you guys want to stick around for a bit, actually, this one's going to be kind of a long form video. I have a lot to cover, but again, I'm going to walk you through my process, my plan, and how I plan to use DMR for real-world applications. So the big question is, why DMR, or digital mobile radio? It's something that I have been considering for the last couple years. I had been an analog operator, and recently I discovered that I had a gap in my communications plan, and that's that I do not have a secure method of communication for local communication. Communication that may be anywhere from 1 to 5 miles, maybe on the upper end up to about 20 miles. So definitely not the long range stuff that I do on HF. And again, I don't look for a problem to solve. I literally wanted to solve this, and I found that having a digital mode at my disposal would actually raise the bar on those that could actually eavesdrop. So I eliminate a lot of the analog listening audience. The other reason for DMR is that it actually is rooted in the commercial space, so a lot of the equipment out there has the ability to enable encryption. And before all of the hamsters go crazy, I do have my FCC business license. I may do another video on that, so I can actually run DMR with encryption enabled completely legitimately, at least for the next 10 years. So that's another reason why I have made the investment in some DMR equipment on the used market, and also in terms of my FCC license, so everything is legit. Now that I know that I want to use DMR as a tool, the big question is, how do we ramp ourselves up? Well, I like to start very small and start from first principles, and it really is helpful if you start from a point that you already know. Now, I already do know analog radio, so that's where I want to start. So my first goal is to get a radio that supports both analog and digital, and bring over those analog concepts to this world. That'll allow me to get familiar with the programming software, first and foremost, but second, also start to use the radio. And I already know that I am successful doing various modes of analog communication. From there, we can layer on other concepts, starting with maybe doing digital for simplex. So baby steps, guys. That's really the key here to make sure that you don't get overwhelmed, or at least that's what I use to not get overwhelmed. So I'm going to let my ADHD really kick in here and share with you guys some of my personal notes. In fact, I wrote this plan even before I started learning DMR. And this is just how I like to think of the world. I think of the world in terms of lists. So my learning roadmap was fairly straightforward. We're actually going to cover 1 through 6 in this video, and then the other ones in part of the later series. So number 1, I want to make sure that I select a DMR radio for this application that will meet my needs. We'll get into this one in a second. Initially, I also thought that I wanted to obtain a DMR ID. Turns out that I did not need it, even though I did go through that process. Number 3, I need to install the software. So for those of you guys that have the Baofangs and are used to chirp, there's something in the DMR world that they call CPS, or the Customer Programming Software. It's the exact same thing. It's just the software that we use to program this radio. And the CPS will vary from vendor to vendor. AnyTone actually has a really nice package. It's still a bit more complicated than I would have liked, but not a big deal. The other thing I found about a year ago when I first bought this AnyTone D878 was that it was locked, and there was absolutely no instructions on the manual on how to do that. So I knew that I wanted to find out how to unlock the radio. We'll get into that. Then it was really quite simple. I wanted to start out with some analog programming. So basically, once that software was installed and I had the radio unlocked, the ability to do simplex frequencies in here. So just things like the 2-meter calling frequency, program an analog repeater. I even looked at APRS. That's not really going to be covered in this video. And then the ability to go and add everything that was in a large spreadsheet that I showed you guys, I think in a video a few months ago, on how I program my radios for interoperability. Next up, number 6, is programming it for digital simplex use, and that's where we're going to end this video. The rest of the format is really, or the rest of the plan here is to interoperate with other radios that I plan to bring into my suite. I don't really plan on running the AnyTone all that much. I actually will likely settle on the Motorola Moto Turbo line for several reasons we'll get into much later. And then I do want to set up a single frequency repeater. I'm going to try to do that with the AnyTone 578. There's a couple pieces there at the end that I'm actually not going to do, period, because it falls into the traditional DMR scene where you have to connect DMR over the internet, and that's either using a local repeater or running a hotspot yourself. So guys, that's my roadmap. That's how I approached each of those learning baby steps. So the first thing on my list was actually to find a DMR radio that worked with my budget and met my needs. I landed on the AnyTone D878 UV2 Plus. That's a really terrible model number and name, but I went with it for a number of reasons. Number one, it is widely adopted. It seems to have a large base of operators that tend to like it. I disagree with the broader audience on that one based on my experience using this, but it is a perfectly acceptable radio and has a lot of functionality built in. It also has support for analog and digital, so it meets that need of that transitional need to go from analog to digital and still have analog as a mode of operation for interoperability. Again, I mentioned the reason for me moving to DMR was to have slightly higher operational security compared to analog, so just using DMR even on the amateur radio bands completely legitimately solves that problem in my opinion. The other cool thing about the AnyTone 878 was that it does support AES 256-bit encryption where you can assign the keys in the CPS software. So that is something that was really kind of driving this particular model. I didn't have to find crypto cards on the internet and go through a lot of hoops. Again, I plan to use mine with my commercial or business license, so it's completely legal for me to transmit on my 5 frequencies using the encryption that is available on these AnyTones. Now, another compelling feature was the built-in support for APRS, the Automatic Packet Reporting Service. I found that the APRS implementation on this was almost completely broken. I actually prefer APRS on my Yaesus, so I'm no longer going to be using APRS on this radio. And then the last one that was kind of interesting is this AnyTone in particular is actually a Part 90 radio. It's not a Part 97 radio that falls under amateur radio. It does cover the amateur radio bands. The cool thing about it being a Part 90 radio is that I can use it for my business license, but it also is fully unlocked on all the bands. So in a scenario where I would need to interoperate with other services, I can actually use transmit on FRS, GMRS, MERS, all my business frequencies, all the amateur radio frequencies, and not that I would ever do it, even some of the first responder frequencies that fall into that range. And the cool thing, unlike my amateur radios, is that I don't need a Mars cat mod. The fact that this is a commercial radio, it is fully unlocked for transmission on both the 2 meter and the 440 megahertz band. So that's why the AnyTone. So I almost forgot, one other thing I do like about the AnyTone is that it came with the USB programming cable. Unlike my Yaesus, where you have to spend 30 or 40 bucks, it came standard. Now, as I was going through this journey of trying to figure out all of the things that I had questions to, I actually found one great resource, and that's BridgeCom Systems. Their YouTube channel answered a lot of questions. So I use that on and off through here, so I don't want to reinvent the wheels, so I'll give you guys a pointer when we get to it. The first thing I actually did was crack open the manual, and I wanted to figure out how to unlock this bad boy. Did a search, and the BridgeCom system guys came up and said you need to basically install the CPS or the customer programming software to unlock it if you have the Part 90 radio like I did. So the very first thing I did was look at the manual, and I bought my radio from PowerWorks. And basically under the software download section on PowerWorks had the version of the CPS. I think at the time of this recording, it was version 3.02 2. It was an easy download. I basically had to actually install Windows 10 on my CF20 for dual boot operation, and I'm primarily using Windows 10 now for the various Windows programming software for things like this DMR application. I'm not going to go into it because it's really just a simple Windows installer, but I will show you some of the programming we're going to do here in a second. All right, so we have to do a few things. I have the AnyTone D878 connected via USB to my Windows 10 machine. And we're going to do two things. One, we're going to go ahead and save the Codeplug. We'll talk about what that is, and we'll also quickly walk through how to unlock the keypad on the Part 90 radios here. So at this point, I already have CPS, or the customer programming software, installed, so we'll go ahead and open that up. Before we do that, we need to go ahead and also determine which COM port we're using. I actually like to use the device manager really quickly to see which port it is. It's typically the last one when you plug it in, but an easy way, like I said, is to launch device manager, go to ports, and you can see here USB serial device is COM7. So we just need to file that away. Now, the very first thing I like to do with any radio where we're dealing with a code plug, actually, let's pause. People get confused about code plug. In my opinion, I don't think you should start with somebody else's code plug. I think you should build your own, and all a code plug is all of the settings for your particular radio. Every radio has one, even my analog radios. They even have a code plug when they come from the factory. It's just the default settings, and it's always a good idea to save those settings first, just in case you need to go back to that kind of pristine condition. So just remember, code plug is all of the settings for your radio that's saved to a file. So in the AnyTone software, we need to go to set, we'll set to COM, and COM port 7 is already selected. The next thing we want to do is do program, and we want to read from radio. And you want to do this the first time out, so we'll go ahead and read that. I'm not going to go ahead and read any of the digital contacts. So pretty quick. The next thing that I like to do, and this is just for belt and suspenders, I will go to File, Save As, and I will save that factory one. You can actually see here I've got a bunch listed, but I have, for example, right here, the AnyTone D878. I've got the radio, the model number, the timestamp, so basically the year, 2023, 09, which was September, 21, which was the 21st, and the first revision. So I have a way to roll back. Anytime I personally make a change, you can kind of see that I will update the date timestamp there, along with a revision like R2, R3, R4, etc. So that's just something I like to do. So really straightforward. Anytime I plug it in, I always read, and then we'll make a save. Let's go ahead and take a look at the first thing I had to do, and that was unlock the radio. And again, I'm not reinventing the wheel here. I literally went to this link for BridgeCom, and they had a great little step-by-step walkthrough. It's really only 3 steps. I went to common settings, optional settings, key function. It can be overwhelming, and then you basically turn off these settings here. So I don't want to go into it. Actually, let's go into common settings, optional settings real quick. So we'll do common settings, optional settings, and then it was key function. And where the heck is key function? So this can be intimidating. I think this is one of the reasons why people are afraid of DMR, is that it has a lot of settings. As you can see here, we have the keyboard lock is turned off, and there are a couple of other settings. All you would do is click OK, and then write it back to the radio. For example, if I wanted to write this back to the radio, I would just do write to radio, and it would persist it there. If I were to make another change, I typically will save it and increment the version number again. So initially I went through the process of obtaining a DMR ID for the Brandmeister network. It turns out that I actually did not need it for my use case, but I do want to show you where I went ahead and configured it, because it literally was the first thing I did after getting my radios. So on the AnyTone software, we'll go to digital, and we'll go to radio ID list here. Now I have 2 radio IDs. The first one actually is that Brandmeister radio ID if I wanted to play with all the hams, which I have no intention of doing. And my ID is 3202601, and it's based on my amateur radio call sign. So I went ahead and added that radio ID as well as a name for it. I could have just used my call sign. You'll notice that there's a second ID, and this is something that I self-assigned for this particular radio. We'll get into how I allocate my radio IDs, but this AnyTone is known by 301, and I have a convention which we'll also get into. AT, I'm using it for AnyTone. POR is for portable. This is a handheld portable, and it's the first AnyTone in my fleet. So if I had two, I would have AT, POR, 2 and increment as necessary. So that's how you set the DMR IDs for your radio. And the nice thing about the ones that are used for amateur radio use, unlike the commercial ones, I found that it makes it very easy to have multiple DMR IDs, and you can assign them per channel. All right, so this next one is not for everybody. I kind of did this for fun. These AnyTones have the ability to put a boot screen, and since I have a logo that my graphic artist put together for me, thanks a lot, Kyle, I decided to have him design for me using the constraints for loading a image for boot up on these radios. And again, this just came directly from the guys over at BridgeCom Systems. So high level here is that the resolution for me was 160 by 128 pixels. I saved it as a bitmap file, and then I have all the directions here on the screen to get that going. So we're really not going to go into that. The next thing I wanted to do was program it for a local analog repeater. This was my first baby step to make sure that I could do the same things I was doing with my Yaesus, but now with this crossover radio. And again, this was sourced directly from the guys over at BridgeCom Systems. So in terms of things that you need to have at your disposal, it is the channel name, or what I would used to call the frequency label, the receive and transmit frequency, the channel type, we set that to analog. The transmit power for that channel, I typically set mine to high most of the time. The bandwidth, so with analog radio, we always use 25 kilohertz. With DMR, per the specification, we're actually only using 12.5 kilohertz, exactly half. It's a lot more efficient in terms of the bandwidth. And then you need to also capture for the repeater like the PL tone. So let's go ahead and walk through that process real quick. And actually, before we do that, let me show you something. So a few weeks ago, or actually well over a month ago, I did a video where I showed you guys how I program my radios for preparedness. I'm actually drawing on that same list. So this first bucket here, I have a bank on the radio, or on the analog world, a memory bank. In the DMR world, they call them zones. So when you hear bank and zone, you can think of those as being interchangeable, and it's just a grouping of memory channels. But this is the same list of repeaters I have in my area, and we'll go ahead and take a look at how one of these was configured. Again, this new spreadsheet also includes the digital stuff I'm doing, so for the Buy Me a Coffee guys, as a thank you, you'll have my full spreadsheet as well. So let's go back over to this guy over here. And the first thing we want to do is go to our channels list. And this is our first channel. It is a 440 megahertz analog repeater. And again, it's overwhelming the first time you see the screen. There's a lot going on here. But I gave it a channel name, or what I called before a label. So I just called it Daisy for Daisy Mountain. That's the name of the repeater. I put in the receive frequency and also the transmit frequency, and these are all available using things like the Repeater Book application or the Repeater Book website. The next one that is important is selecting A-analog. That designates it as analog. You can set the power level to whatever you want. I'm putting it on the maxed power setting, typically because I'm a bit farther out from the repeater system. And then this is important. I think by default, it tries to pick 12.5 kilohertz because that's the standard for DMR. It needs to be set to 25 kilohertz for analog radio. Everything else I pretty much skipped. And then in terms of the PL tone, the only thing I need to put in is on the CTCSS encode. I set that to the encoding type, and then also the the tone, and in our area, the 440 megahertz repeaters use a 100 hertz tone. Again, this is all information that's in repeater book, and go ahead and save that. Now, you're not done there. That just adds a channel. There's no way to access it on the radio until you do one other thing. So you head over to zone, and again, I like to think of zones as memory banks. And I created a memory bank called AHAM RPTR. It stands for Analog Ham Radio Repeater. And then what you end up having here is a list of all of the channels that you have programmed, and you have the ability to go ahead and click on one of these. So for example, here's Daisy Mountain and Shaw Butte. It looks like I forgot to bring over Air Park, and I think I had another repeater in here. Oh yeah, Mount Ord. So these four will now be under a new memory bank or zone called Daisy. I'll click OK. And just to prove to you guys that this is no smoke and mirrors, we're going to go ahead and go through my process. I will do save as. Today is still the 14th, so I'm just going to bump this up to version 14. Again, this is my convention for having lots of different backups of my Codeplug, or more simply, my radio's configuration. So the file's been saved, and now all I'm going to do is do program and write to radio, and this should take almost no time. Digital contact list, since I did not make any changes to the contact lists, I'm just going to go ahead and write all the other data. And this should take about 10 seconds or so for what I'm doing. So guys, that is pretty straightforward. That's all that is needed. The radio is going to go through this kind of process of copying. Do not kind of muck with it. It'll reboot itself. It'll show the boot logo screen. And then the last thing it's going to do here, I just want to show you really quickly that I'm not messing with you guys. All right, there's the boot screen. And then you can kind of see here, I've got the zone, so I can page through this. So I'm on AHAM repeater, and then I can use the knob here to go ahead and go to Air Park and Mount Ord. Those were the last two that we added. All right, so this next one I'm not going to get into. It's how to configure the AnyTone for analog APRS. This is a service that I do use a lot and have used and have covered it quite a bit on the channel. And I will tell you, I am really disappointed with this implementation. When you have busy nets, it has the ability to boot you out of the process of creating and addressing messages. I hope they fix this at some point, but for me, I found it nearly impossible when dealing with an APRS net where we had 500 check-ins. There's other issues, I'm not going to get into them, but you can also see here, based on my screen, there is well over a 10-step process just to get APRS working on this radio. And again, this one came directly from the guys over at BridgeCom Systems. So a few other things I won't get into. I'm just going to share these notes. I also had the question of how do I check for my firmware? And for those of you guys who are not technically savvy, all the firmware is kind of the operating system of your radio. It's not the code plug. Think of it as like if this was Windows 10 or Windows 11, that's kind of the firmware. And they will fix issues. So example, I basically said APRS, in my opinion, at the time I got this radio was completely broken. By providing a new version of the firmware, they have the ability to fix this. So there is a process where you can download new versions of the firmware that have patches and use the CPS or customer programming software that we were using to load it. So that was one other thing that I wanted to do. So I had two questions here. One, how do I check what my current firmware is? And the other one is, how do I update my firmware? Everything else here are some definitions. Let's go ahead and knock those out of the way. I wasn't planning on doing it. Apologies for typos. This was something that I kind of did. This were notes for myself. This wasn't designed for public consumption, but I don't mind sharing it with the Buy Me a Coffee folks. Frequency is the same in the analog and digital world. The only difference is that in the analog world, it's 25 kilohertz wide in terms of bandwidth. And for DMR, it's exactly half of that. It's 12.5 kilohertz. Color code. I like to think of color code as a PL tone. In fact, it really has no colors whatsoever. It is a number 1 through 15, and it really just allows you to not be able to open up the frequency unless both radios have the same color code. And these are user or repeater assignable. DMR does have one thing called TDMA, time division multiple access. And what they do is they'll take that 12.5 kilohertz bandwidth and they chop it in half. So you end up having 6.25 kilohertz. So what's cool about this is you can have one frequency, but you can use it for voice and data on two different channels. So you kind of double your abilities. So for example, with the FCC and my business license, I have 5 frequencies allocated for shared use for me. I only have 5 frequencies when I'm on analog, but the fact that TDMA for DMR splits that in half, I actually have more like 10 frequencies at my disposal, which is really nice. And then the time slot really is, are you using the first half of that slice or the second half of that slice? So again, I can use time slot 1 to talk to like the security team, and time slot 2 to talk to command, for example, and they can sit on the same frequency. Really interesting stuff. The zone is pretty straightforward. The zone, I like to think of those as memory banks in the analog world. So I will call them like 2 meter zone is the same thing as my 2 meter memory bank. Scan groups, we're not going to get into for this video. It's really not relevant, but the important one here is talk groups. Talk groups are just contacts, and this is where those radio IDs become important. So you have essentially 2 kinds of talk groups. You have a private talk group where you talk between one radio and another radio directly. So let's say I have radio ID 1 wants to talk to radio ID 2, and the other one is a talk group where you have a whole group of people that can be in one group or the other. And I'll show you how I carve mine out, or how I plan to carve mine out, so that it makes sense for my operational use case. So guys, those are the high level definitions and concepts. When looking at DMR through my lens, which is just simplex use, no repeaters, and really not looking at it to connect it to the internet. All right, folks, you guys are not gonna wanna hear this, but for DMR, you do need to have a plan on what you want to do. In fact, I think everybody should have a plan. I think this is part of the reason why that video I did last month on how I program my radios for interoperability was wildly successful. Thank you so much for that. So I wanna walk you through my plan. So my objectives for DMR are as follows. Number 1, I want to communicate with my circle, and this is my trusted circle. It is really my immediate family, and for all intent and purpose, it's really for myself, my wife, and for when the kids are over. The other who I want to talk to are the neighbors, and I kind of call these, it's the local mutual assistance. So if something were to happen on really a scale that impacts society for more than a day, this is when I want to bring my neighborhood in and together to support each other, and I want to be able to hand out some of my radios. But I do want to have a clean separation of the communications for my family versus the neighbors. The third is my actual mutual assistance group. We're actually spread out throughout the Southwest, and this is a scenario where I need to communicate with that group either over HF when we're dealing with the Southwest or even parts of the state, but a lot of them are 20 miles out, so we actually have the ability to deploy some local repeater infrastructure and be able to keep in contact. So those are the 3 people that I want to keep in contact with. My other communication goal is that I want to have some interoperability between some of the different vendor platforms, basically my AnyTone radios and my Moto Turbo radios. Yeah, I think that's it. So let's jump into a spreadsheet here. I really want you guys to get a sense for how I do things, because I think it'll help you kind of walk through that process of what your goals are and tease them out, because it'll influence how you program these radios. All right, guys, so this spreadsheet is only going to be distributed to the Buy Me a Coffee crowd, and it is very similar to what I did from the analog world. So at a high level, I have basically all of my zones here. So the first zone is what I'm calling AHAM repeater, my analog amateur radio repeaters, and I just have the immediate ones in my area. So analog at this point, no DMR. Next up, kind of like that last video I did, AHAM 2 meters. These are all of the 2 meter simplex frequencies. So I have the nationwide calling frequency, APRS, a bunch of other frequencies that I use. So all of my Yaesu radios can interoperate with these guys. Likewise, I also have the analog amateur radio frequencies for the 70 centimeter band, since this AnyTone is a dual band radio. I do have a placeholder for crossband repeat. One of my AnyTone radios is the mobile version of this. It's the AnyTone 578, which has a feature called crossband repeat, where I can transmit on one frequency and receive on a different frequency, basically on two different bands. Don't have that programmed yet, but I know that I do want a zone for that in the future. I always program NOAA weather radio just because I do want to have access to local analog weather information over the air. MIRS, same thing, the multi-use radio service, we talked about this before. While it's not legal for me to transmit on, with this radio I technically can key up on MIRS, and I have the 5 frequencies allocated as analog channels on a zone called MIRS. APRS and GMRS, same thing. You're technically not supposed to transmit on this radio. You can, it's up to you guys if you want to be creative with the FCC regulations, but I still will program everything in and put those into, in some cases, 2 zones. Some of my radios only support 16 channels per zones. Don't think the AnyTone falls into that category. And then also kind of all the first responder stuff. We talked about this. Check out this video up here. So I've got the local fire departments. I've got the local Department of Public Safety. I've got a local search and rescue list from the NIFOG manual, the local mutual assistance group that pairs with our sheriff's department. I've got a bank or a zone called ATTP, Analog The Tech Prepper, and it has my 5 business frequencies for analog FM use listed here. So guys, I told you this was going to be a long video, but again, I need to get all of this information out because I have a video that I have commitments for next week. So the next tab is use cases and scenarios. If you guys are not looking at what your personal requirements are for using radio, you may want to think about that. Again, the goal of this video, part of it is for you to look at what I'm doing. So I have 3 primary use cases for local, more secure communication. And the way that I've broken this down, the first one is I have a goal of communicating with immediate family. The second one that I have is to communicate with my neighbors. And the third one is to communicate with my broader mutual assistance group. There is some overlap between those last 2. So looking at column A, we have the different types of operators for each use case. The first one is my family. In the case of the neighbors, I've got family, the neighbors, and the last one is obviously the mutual assistance group. Now I've carved out some different applications for my communications need. So let's just start at the top here. So I have sports and recreation, travel, and then preparedness. There may be more of these. So the scenario is I'm out hiking, I'm out trail running, or I'm out going hunting like I was the other day with the boys. And my wife may be at the house and maybe she wants to keep in contact and we only have, again, less than 5 miles between us. I want her to be able to keep tabs on me outside of having her cell phone. So that usage frequency is daily. The security needs are low. I could use a combination of data and voice, and by data I mostly mean like things like the text messaging features that are available, kind of like a old school flip phone. And then in some cases I do want to have GPS. I'm the owner of those radios, so I put self, and then the last one is which channel do I want to use, and I'm creating something called TTP EDC, or everyday carry. So the EDC channel will be carved out just for my family and my inner circle's needs. I'm not going to go through all of these, but we have things like the Jeep and RV trips that we do where we may move to another area, and we'll do this monthly or quarterly. Security is low, kind of like the other one. Again, this is primarily for my wife and I and the kids to use. Preparedness, short-term power outage is a good example. Maybe it's just a few hours and we don't have access to our cell tower. We can bust these bad boys out. We'll call the security moderate. I really don't think it's a huge issue, so no encryption is really needed. We'll primarily use voice when walking around the property. All right, so the next one is communicating with the neighbors. And again, I have a pretty good list here that does fall under sports and recreation when the neighbors are included in some of the activities I do out in the backcountry. Travel, we do caravan together. So we just did a trip to Bisbee, Arizona, where we had 3 neighbors get together. And rather than having cell phone, it was nice to hand out MIRS radios, or in my case, the business radios. And we were able to, actually I didn't hand out the business radios for this first use case, it was MIRS. And we were able to quickly just keep tabs on each other without having to initiate a cellular call. The big difference here is that anytime I hand out a radio that is not part of my closed circle, I'm using a different channel that I'm calling TTP field. My EDC radios for right now are the Motorola 7550. Since these are more expensive radios, I bought all mine on the used market. These are the radios I used for my wife and I, and the radios that fall under TTP field are the loaner ones, and I'm using kind of these older, more beat up Moto turbos, and this is the XPR 6550, mostly because these radios run me about $100. So in my fleet, I have 2 of these. I've got 2 of these ones, and I plan to get probably 4 more total. So we're not going to worry about the power outage. Let's get to some real meat and potatoes in terms of the preparedness application. So let's say that there is a short-term weather impacting scenario. Maybe it's a flood in our area. That's the most common when we have monsoons and neighbors need support. This may or may not be the thing that a first responder may need to be involved in, but maybe we have to coordinate bringing equipment like heavy machinery, shovels, sandbags. This does happen every couple of years out here. Security needs, they're probably low to moderate, and data and voice is sufficient. So again, here I own all the radios. I just hand it out to be that guy in my community that provides that skill. And I'll use TTP EDC for my wife and I, and then we'll use the channel TTP field for kind of all of the field radios. This next one, I'm going to call this short-term civil unrest, and this actually did happen with the George Floyd kind of rioting, where people kind of took advantage of the situation and just started knocking over crap in the Phoenix and Scottsdale area. They did not come to our location, but the neighbors were kind of scared. So I'm going to mark this as rare, but it can happen, especially with things like COVID and other demonstrations taking place. Security needs, in my experience, are high. This is a scenario where I will use the encrypted communication. I have 5 channels that are unencrypted under my business license, and then I have another 5 that are on the same frequencies, different time slot, that are fully encrypted, and with my business license in my area, all the neighbors are permitted to use that. So it was one hell of an investment. When we do have to move to that scenario where we're dealing maybe with a longer weekend, I have another channel now where we'll have 3 radios out there. We have TTP EDC, again, local family communication, nobody else, TTP field, kind of everybody else, and then what I'm calling TTP command or TTP CMD. And this is maybe I want to have a operating center at my house and then one at the front of the street where we barricade and block the front of the street, and we minimize traffic between those 2 operating locations. We can have a third. But anybody that's kind of walking around mobile, they fall under TTP field, and this is to kind of segment our communication. All right, so the last bucket here is when the mutual assistant group actually needs to get together, and this happens, and has not happened yet, thankfully, if there is a long-term issue where we really do have a breakdown. And in my mind, the indicator is that civil servants, fire department, police departments, first responders are not able to get to you because they're overwhelmed or dealing with their own situation and there are bad actors. In this scenario, everything is either moderate or high security communications. We will use primarily encrypted data and voice. In general, I'm actually favoring encrypted data, mostly because the bursts are very small and not as long-lived as voice, but it doesn't mean we can't do that. And then here we have 4 different channels. I've got EDC for my family in closed circle, TTP field for the handout radios to the community, TTP command for those operating locations, and then MAG. This is where my mutual assistant group and I have got about 5 or 6 guys in this group. We coordinate and we each bring our own equipment, so we'll have reserve channels that we can interoperate on. Guys, with all of that said, let's go ahead and take a look at how I've laid out my digital channels. I'm not going to show this in the programming software because this video is getting long, but basically in terms of my zones, I have a handful. I have DTTP, this stands for digital TTP. This has my 5 frequencies and they're all in the 400 megahertz band. And what I'll do just for simplicity is I will use color code 1 for all of those 5 frequencies just to make things easy. And then I'll use time slot 1 on the first 4 to cover basically the different types of talk groups as well. So talk groups again are a way of having, you can either have private or talk groups. I've got one called TTP all that actually is assigned to the TTP all channel, so I have a one-to-one relationship. And the reason why I can do that is that I have 5 frequencies at my disposal, technically 10 if you count time slot 1 and 2. So again, we've got a channel within the zone digital TTP. It's for EDC, and that has a talk group of TTP EDC. So all of the family members will be able to hear and transmit with each other. TTP field, again, is a separate channel for digital, and it also has a corresponding talk group of the same name, so all of the neighbors can hear each other on that one channel. And the convention goes on. I've got TTP command for the 2 or 3 operating locations, and again, there is a talk group there for TT command, and that's to minimize chatter. There will be no more than 2, maybe 3 operators on that channel and in that talk group. The last one is for TTP data. This actually deals with some of the work I'm doing that you'll see in a future episode that deals with the Moto Turbo stuff that I have been working on. And I have purposely given it a different time slot of 2. And the reason for that is that I can monitor basically voice and then digital on the other one by doing time slot 1, time slot 2. All right, so the next zone is almost identical to the previous one. It is called DSTTP for digital secure, and I can deploy a variety of techniques for having secure channels. So they follow the same convention of channel name plus the S for secure, and have the same talk groups like TTP, all, EDC, etc. So the only difference is that I actually do have encryption turned on, and again, this is with my business license. What I did do a bit differently is the color codes for all of my secure channels are on number 2, just so that I don't have kind of any collision with the other set of unencrypted channels. My mutual assistant group, I actually have technically like 4 known groups. Internally, it's Alpha, Delta, I've got Golf and Sierra, and we have different frequencies that we use. Not everybody in all of these mags know each other. I actually am sort of a hub for different groups. So I have communication with just about all of them, but not everybody is also working with them. So we've kind of aligned on which channel, which frequency, which color code. So meet with your group if that's the case. The last 2 are for mostly the Motorola side. I will say one nice thing about the AnyTones is that you do have some level of front panel programming where you can change and add frequencies. On the commercial radios, you really can't do that. You have to do everything in software. So as a cheat or as a workaround, I have 2 called front panel programming time slot 1 and another zone called front programming panel or time slot 2. And then I have basically 15 channels in each zone to correspond to color code 1 through 15, because a lot of these radios will let you change the frequency, but you can't change the color code or the time slot. So that's more technical, guys. I really just wanted to kind of show you how I plan things out. The GoPro took a dump. It does not like these long videos. So let me quickly show you how we can program one of these digital frequencies. So I've gone to the channel section of the CPS software. And as an example, we're going to use one of the frequencies. We're going to use, pretend we're doing the DTTP zone, the digital zone, and we're going to do it for the create a channel called DTTP all. So this is a channel where all of the radios everybody can hear each other. So DTTP all for the channel name. For the frequency, you put whatever simplex frequency is permitted for your band plan in your area. There are a few of DMR specific frequencies that are permitted on the 440 megahertz band that I'm aware of. In my case, I would put the 2 business frequencies here. And since we're doing simplex, I would put the same frequency for both receive and transmit. The channel type, obviously now this time is D-digital for digital. For right now, I'll do high power. If I had very high security requirements, I would put this on the lowest power and probably use directional antennas and minimize transmission. The bandwidth for digital is always locked to 12.5 kilohertz, so nothing we need to do there. The big area over here is the area that has to do with a lot of the DMR specific settings that come out of our spreadsheet. So the person that I want to talk to, which talk group is it, this channel will actually send everything to the talk group that I created earlier. That step was actually first. I should have showed you guys how to do that first, but let's pretend we created the talk group first for TTP all. So we set that as the contact to transmit on. Now, the cool thing about, again, the amateur radios is that we can have multiple DMR IDs. The top one that has my call sign is the actual Brandmeister DMR ID, which I don't plan to use. In this case, I'm actually using the DMR ID for my specific radio, which is 301. The spreadsheet called for color code 1. Again, you have the ability to put 1 through 15 there. I don't know why they call them color codes. They are basically number codes. You have 2 slots, slot 1 and 2. I'm actually going to be using time slot 2 for my encrypted channels that are identical to this, so I can use the same frequencies for both. The received group list right now, I'm just keeping that to none. It doesn't really prevent anything for what I want to do at this point. We'll go to zone, and under zone for DTTP, you notice that I have the all channel listed there, so we do that assignment. I did fail to do one thing first, and that was the talk groups. Under the AnyTone, it's under contact talk groups. So you notice here that I have my private talk groups. So I've got 2, which is my main control station radio. The ones that my wife and I carry are 101, 102. Those map to EDC1 and EDC2. I have the field radios right now. I just have 1 field radio because I don't have enough radios, and it has the ID of 201 with the name TTP Field 1, and then the 2 AnyTones are 301 and 302. And these are all private. All of the group calls where I want to deal with a bunch of people, again, per the spreadsheet, I've got group ID 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15. So just to bring it home again, I basically captured all of the analog channels in the spreadsheet along with their groups. I came up with all my operating use cases. I have all of my digital zones and their channel characteristics. And then this was my DMR kind of workflow of step 1, inventory all of your radios, self-assign IDs, create our talk groups, which has both the private and the group call. We create the channel. We assign all of the frequency, time slot, color code, the target talk groups we want to talk to. We create a zone. We assign the channel to that zone, and then we're good to go. All right, guys, this was a long video. It's not exactly the video I wanted, but the goal here was to show you, number 1, that yes, you can use DMR for an application where it's not tied to the internet. You can use it for local simplex radio-to-radio communication. It has a little bit more of a learning curve. So again, my approach was to start with analog radio, learn the software, learn the radio, then build a plan on how I want to use my digital network for my community, my family, and my group. And I kind of used all of these spreadsheets together. And ultimately now I believe I have a radio, at least on the AnyTone side, that covers me for all of the amateur radio use, as well as all of those different levels of very low security to moderate security to high security when stuff goes sideways. Again, feel free to poke holes in this because I am new to DMR, but this is my best effort in the 2 months that I've been looking at DMR, by looking at DMR as a tool and completely different than all of the amateur radio operators. Again, the notes, the spreadsheets, and probably even a sanitized Codeplug at some point will only be distributed to the Buy Me a Coffee people. It's just a thank you that I want to give those guys for helping support this channel. For everybody else, just pause the video at the various points. Hopefully there's something for everyone in this video. Be strong, be safe, and be prepared.